Two lines before we begin, this story will challenge what you believe about justice, mercy, and the things that happen in the quiet hours when no one is watching. Listen close, it's one of those rare tales that asks you to decide whether to call it miracle or madness. If this reaches you, please like the video and subscribe so you won't miss the next story that moves between prayer and the impossible. Hit the bell if you want to follow every step of this journey with us. Leave a comment below with your name and where you're watching from. Tonight we gather in prayer, together. The night the town of Holloway learned how thin the line between sin and salvation can be, a cold wind pushed through the elm trees that ringed Main Street like sentries. Holloway sat on a stretch of country road in Ohio where the factories had once hummed and the church bell still marked the hour with the steadiness of a heartbeat. It was the sort of town where everyone knew everyone's grandfather and where rumors traveled faster than the county newspaper. The church, a low, white-steepled building on the corner of Church and Mill, was as much a part of the town's map as the diner and the hardware store. On Sunday mornings you could find old men in wool coats on the front pews, farmers with rough hands and clean shirts, and kids with sticky fingers stealing a glance at the stained glass. Holloway had its legends, the kind people told to keep their children safe or to explain the storms that took roofs. One well-known story involved a small roadside shrine, a hand-carved statue of the Virgin Mary tucked under the roots of an old oak on Route 12. Folks called it Our Lady of the Hollow. It wasn't fancy, a chipped blue paint, a wooden plaque nailed crookedly, but generations had left coins and rosaries there, and the statue had been a comfort after floods and layoffs and the year when the baseball team didn't win a single game. Mothers told their children to cross themselves when they passed it, men knocked a fist against their thigh and muttered a prayer before long drives. To the people of Holloway, the statue was not a relic of religion so much as a neighborhood anchor, small and stubborn as the town itself. Michael Carter knew the shrine as a child. He remembered his mother, Maria, folding a rosary into her palm like it was a private flame. She carried a metal medal, a worn image of the Virgin passed down from her mother, and she would point to the shrine every time they drove by. Say a little one for safety, she'd whisper, and Michael would mutter a line he didn't understand the depth of yet. Hail Mary, full of grace. What followed after those early prayers was not the story of someone born holy. It was, instead, a story of choices and bad company, of nights in a car park and dares taken under a moon. By 16, Michael had found his place in a small, tight knot of boys who lived by rough rules. They smoked behind warehouses and learned how a flat silence at a party could be worth a quick thrill. Holloway's blocks were small. Anything that happened in the alley behind O'Leary's feed store was whispered. Down to the diner by noon, Michael learned to be quick, to keep his head down, to make himself a shadow when it suited him. There was a night when the boys drove past the shrine and laughed, the way young people sometimes laugh at what steadies their elders. It was stupid, it was mean, and Michael joined in because that's what young men do when they have more bravado than sense. Someone kicked at the wooden base. Someone else threw beer at the statue. Michael remembers the scrape of paint under his sneaker and the small, hollow sound the statue made when it tipped. He remembers the taste of shame the next morning, a dry, sour thing you swallow and hope never returns. He remembers, too, how easily the town forgave youthful vandalism, until forgiveness no longer felt cheap in the mouth of a guilt-ridden boy. The years that followed were not kind. Michael fell deeper into the wrong circles, and the petty things became a ladder for worse acts. At 18 he had his first run-ins with the law, quick arrests, short stays, the kind of records that whisper warnings to employers and landlords. At 25, a night escalated beyond the reckless energy of teenagers. There was a scuffle, a woman in danger, a gun that thundered once. A police officer named Patrick O'Connor lost his life that night. The official story the town learned was brutal and simple enough: an attempted sexual assault, a struggle, and an officer struck down. The trial condensed the messy hows and whys into facts on a sterile docket. Michael swore he didn't fire the shot. He said he was not the one who pulled the trigger, but in a courtroom, certainty often comes wearing the semblance of evidence, and the places that hold truth, memory, conscience, fear, are private and messy and not always convincing to 12 jurors. The trial lasted 2 months. It had a colorless oddness to it, summer leaking into fall, the courthouse fans breathing the same heavy air until everyone in the room felt the case in their bones. The judge, stern and quick in his sentences, called Michael dangerous and unrepentant in his summation. The public defender, overworked and new to a case that demanded experience more than sympathy, could not stitch a narrative strong enough to pull the jury from their conclusion. 4 hours of deliberation and a verdict that felt like thunder to Michael: guilty, with a maximum sentence. In the small courtroom, Michael's mother collapsed. She had worn the medal the whole time, the one she'd never put down. The crowd murmured. A woman in the gallery clasped her hands as if to contain a prayer physically. When the bailiffs led Michael away, his mother's hands reached through the protective glass and the two of them mouthed prayers the way birds might remember their song after a long winter. Prison did not soften him at first. For 8 years, Michael kept to himself in a single, plain cell, the walls like a patient judge. Nights were long and the days, when they came, were measured in small exchanges and the clang of the chow line. He kept the image of his childhood tarnished by later choices close to the ribcage where memory lived. There were nights when he thought of that small shrine on Route 12 and felt the burn of the boy who kicked wood for a laugh. There were mornings when the rosary in his mother's hands became a steady, shame-contained rhythm he wished he had understood earlier. Maria Carter did not give up. Every week, through glass that smelled faintly of ammonia and bleach, she brought her rosary and the medal and a prayer she prayed even when she could barely lift the words. She had friends who called her stubborn as an ox, and she wore that nickname with a kind of ferocious, quiet pride. Pastor Thomas Mackenzie, a thin man with an Irish lilt in his speech and eyes that had seen suffering before, began to visit, too. He was not a judge or a lawyer. He offered no legal ladders. He offered something harder to measure, the invitation to believe that truth sometimes arrives late and that a conscience could be rebuilt, even within stone. Inside the prison's gray walls, small things began to shift. Michael started to attend a weekly service. The chapel in the prison was a narrow room with bad light, but there were faces in the pews that carried their own stories of loss and, unexpectedly, forgiveness. Michael learned again the prayers his mother had taught him as a child, not out of ritual, but because the words eased the knotted places in his chest. He found a weird, new steadiness in counting rosary beads, the pressure of his thumb on each bead like a small confession whispering itself into the smallness of his palm. Then something else happened, the sort of build-up people in Holloway would later call a pattern of signs, a series of small, strange occurrences that made the guards lower their voices and the inmates cross themselves without thinking about it. In the 5th year, the chapel's candle flame bent sideways during a service though there was no draft in the room. A planted vine in the prison courtyard, a stubborn, brown thing, bloomed suddenly in the middle of January, a single white flower that stunned everyone who saw it. Guards joked about bad wiring and insects, but by the time the 7th year rolled around, even the jokes sounded thinner. On a late October night in 2003, 2 days before his scheduled execution, Michael had what he would call later, in a letter to his mother folded so many times it became soft, a moment that felt like a hinge in time. Maria had persuaded the warden to allow a small, framed image of the Virgin to be kept with Michael through his last night. It had been in the family for decades. The frame was no larger than a palm, wood darkened by years and hands, the paint on the Virgin's face smoothed almost to gentle blur. Michael pressed it to his chest as if cupping a flame. He prayed aloud. That was the first oddness. He prayed for things he had never asked for in public, for pardon, for mercy, for a truth to cut through the walls that had been built around him. He spoke the Hail Mary as a child had taught him and then other lines, phrases he remembered from his mother's mouth like a secret language. He was not particularly devout that whole night. He was a man facing the end and wanting an answer. Sometime after 3 in the morning, the corridor lights were low. The night guard, Steve Martinez, did a routine walk, a check on cells, a nod at the cameras, shoes tapping the echoing deck. He had worked at Holloway Correctional Facility for 15 years and thought he'd seen the range of human behavior the system could produce. He had no reason to expect anything extraordinary that night. Then he saw a light. It wasn't the harsh fluorescent buzz of the hallway, it was a warm, gold glow, soft and steady, as if a candle had been lit inside a heart. At first Martinez assumed it was an electrical reflection from the exit sign. He stepped closer and frowned. The light was coming from Michael's cell. It seemed to emanate from the small framed image he held. He halted like someone had caught him mid-sentence with a prayer. "Michael?" Martinez called through the bars, more a reflex than an interrogation. Michael looked up slowly. The light traced his cheekbones. His eyes were wide but not frightened. He was cradling the frame as if it were a living thing. Martinez could feel the heat of it across the metal door and it made his palms sweat. This is where the town begins to hold its breath. The story of broken faith, of a boy who kicked a shrine and a man who bore the consequences, pivots on a night where an ordinary guard saw something that could not be filed under the usual explanations. Martinez radioed central control in the clipped voice that officers used to keep themselves steady. Within minutes, more lights bled into the corridor, footsteps, murmurs, the creak of keys. The first 2 guards who stepped into the cell block were dismissive at first, blinking against the light's unearthly warmth. Then their faces changed. The kind of change that comes when a person's hands unclench and the shoulders drop because something older and stranger than the world is making a demand they don't understand. When David Walsh finally spoke, his voice came out like someone tearing a bandage too quickly. The corridor felt too small for the thing he was about to unload. for 23 years Walsh had been the sort of guard who made other people nervous by breathing quietly and watching the world like a man who read everything twice. He'd never been known to crack in public, he'd never wept in a corridor. So when he fell to his knees and put both hands to his mouth and said, "I can't keep this inside anymore," the first thing most men felt was that something larger than them had moved. At first the words were indistinct, a wet sound of a man breaking, then the sentence came, each word heavy as iron. "I lied at the trial, Michael did not fire the shot, I didn't tell the truth because Detective Harris threatened me." It dropped into the air like a thrown stone, the guards around him backed away as if the confession might be contagious. Michael, still clutching the warm frame of the Virgin, felt his chest loosen around the years he had held like shackles. If there is one thing small towns know how to do, it is watch a single moment and immediately decide how to tell it. Holloway didn't waste time, a whisper moved from the cell block to the warden's office and out through the gate. The diner in town smelled of coffee and a dozen conversations collided into the same thin thread. A guard had cried and admitted to lying. Judge Marshall, the same man who had sentenced Michael, was contacted. The pastor, Thomas Mackenzie, who had often sat with Michael in the visiting room, walked to the prison with the kind of strange calm that comes when someone believes the world is finally aligning to a truth they've felt in their bones. The county prosecutor's office scrambled. Within hours, a court order was issued to halt the execution. An emergency hearing was scheduled, for Michael, a man who had spent 8 years counting days that were not his. The day changed in the space of a prayer and a hand on a wooden frame. Walsh's confession didn't drop into an empty field, it dug into a rotten, buried bank of complicity that had lain unnoticed for years. He named Detective Richard Harris, a once decorated officer who had long since retired. He named Tommy Rodriguez, a troubled young man who had been in and out of the system and who had left town soon after the shooting. Walsh's words were not only a retraction, they were an accusation of corruption, bribery, intimidation, false testimony. When the county investigators began pulling at that thread, a lot of loose things came with it. Old files were reopened, witness statements were re-examined, phones that had been silent for years began to ring. People in Holloway remembered stories they'd heard at kitchen tables about threats, about favors traded for silence. For some, the confession felt like a cleansing. For others, the families of a dead officer, it felt like a fresh wound. And then the town turned its gaze to the object that had started all of it, the small framed image of the Virgin Mary that had glowed in a cell at 3 in the morning. By noon, the image was at the center of a cluster of quiet men in uniforms and a woman who would not stop praying. Pastor Mackenzie held it with both hands, like a son might hold the hand of his ailing mother. And the light that had been inside that frame felt private again for a moment, as if it had already returned to where it belonged. Word moved beyond Holloway with the speed of a machine humming to life. A reporter from the metropolitan paper called. A local television crew drove through the rain and parked outside the prison fence, their cameras like hungry crows. By evening, the story had bussed the distance between a county line and a nation of strangers who liked to argue about what miracles meant. The prison administrator, juggling subpoenas and crowd control, insisted that any talks about the light be left to the investigators. "We have to be careful," he told anyone who would listen, "this is a legal matter first." Yet legal matters have a way of hitting the tender spots of a town. People lined the courthouse steps as if for a holiday that none of them had ordered. Some held rosaries, some held law books, children were sent to bed early, adults let themselves watch the courthouse with the same attention they might give a brewing storm. Scientists were called in. The little frame that had been handed from mother to grandmother now sat under lamps and probes in gloved hands. Experts in materials science photographed the varnish, scanned the wood grain, ran light readings and spectral analyses. Photographers took high-resolution images that made the Virgin's face look like a thing of private shadow, then like a thing of bright truth, and then like something else the science couldn't name. The initial result from the lab was honest and small. The frame was a simple wooden object, exactly what it appeared to be. The pigments were old, the glass thin, there were no hidden light sources, no secret wiring. The radiology technician, trying to keep his voice steady, said on the record that they could find nothing that explained the warm, golden glow eyewitnesses had described. "No one put LEDs in it," he said, half smiling, half baffled. "It's just wood and paint and years of handling." But experts are trained to distrust absolutes. They ran more tests, they looked for traces of modern materials, they tested the varnish, the oils, the particulate on the surface. Nothing concrete explained how, in the middle of a corrected night, the image had lit a corridor with a glow men described later as soft like a hand and warm like bread. That language would be repeated in Holloway like a prayer. The deeper question for the community wasn't only whether the image could physically produce light, it was this: why did men change because of that light? Walsh's confession, the crux of justice and the pivot of the entire event, was what moved people most. The frame had done its work already. It had undone a lie. That evening, as the mayor watched lines of cars and the town's church bells, he admitted to a reporter he didn't know whether he believed in miracles, but he believed in consequences. If one man says the truth and it changes a life, the mayor said, then maybe we owe God or fate or whatever you call it a thank you. Michael's mother, Maria, could not contain herself. Hollow, worn, and frail from years of praying through glass, she became a small, human beacon outside the prison gates. People reached for her and she gave them the same look she gave the Virgin's medal, a kind of exhausted gratitude that made their throats tighten. When the news came that the execution was stayed, she folded into her husband's arms as if folding back into the map of the world she had always known and prayed over. But the story did not end with a stayed execution. An investigation into Detective Harris's conduct revealed a history of questionable cases, testimonies coerced, evidence mishandled, favors done for the sake of a closed docket. Harris, when reached by the investigators, denied any wrongdoing. He said that confessions can be messy and memories can fray under the pressure of time. He was a man who had worn his badge long enough to survive storms. The town's newspaper ran a photograph of the shrine on Route 12 that had once been toppled by a boy who later became a man on death row. The caption read, in plain font, "From small shrine to big miracle." People argued over the headline in the diner. Some said the shrine had always been a place of comfort. Some said people in Holloway were desperate for hope and ready to see miracles where simple human courage had acted. And human courage had acted. Walsh's confession was human courage shaped by a light that made him small enough to speak. He told authorities about the threats Detective Harris had made. He told them that fear of Harris had kept the truth buried, that witnesses had been coached. The prosecutor's office reopened Michael's case. Lawyers who had once been indifferent to Michael's fate rallied with a new urgency. The defense mounted a motion and the judge, faced with new testimony and an admission of perjury, had no choice. He ordered the case re-examined and released Michael from his sentence while the inquiry continued. On a cold December morning, with frost-like embroidery on the courthouse steps, Michael walked out of the gates not as a man declared innocent simply by paperwork, but as a man whose life had been returned by the slant of other people's honesty. The town gathered. Pastor Mackenzie read from the Bible in a voice that trembled, slower and gentler than a sermon meant to win the faithful, but as if he were reading to a child who had lost their way. "You were lost and are found again," he said. Michael's mother placed the old medal against his chest, and for a moment the world contracted to the small metal disc worn from an old woman's skin. The picture of the Virgin that had warmed a cell and moved a guard was placed under glass in a small room at the center of town. It was wrapped in cloth and then unwrapped and then wrapped again, like a household heirloom. People came in groups to pay respects. They would stand and place coins, stones, a single rose. Some said a prayer out loud, others simply touched the varnish and said nothing. Even the reporters sometimes paused, the sheen of a human mystery softening a line in the copy. Scientists continued to test the frame. A university lab in Columbus ran spectral analysis and found that, during the night of the glow, the surface temperature readings had spiked slightly above ambient. That meant heat, not much, but measurable. The technicians shrugged and said it could be an unexplained thermal event. No one could replicate the glow under controlled conditions. That fact alone sent a particular kind of whisper through Holloway. Whatever this was, it wasn't something the lab could manufacture. It didn't take long for the story to gather a new layer. People came forward with their own small accounts of things that had shifted in their lives after that night. The prison cook, a woman with calloused hands, told how she had stopped drinking after a lifetime of hiding in whiskey and laughter. A young inmate wrote a letter saying the long night he had spent awake had somehow eased in the presence of that small image. The city clerk, a skeptic until then, said she had started buying rosaries for her sister who lived in the city. Yet, not everyone believed. A handful called it a publicity stunt. A few men who had lost a brother or a son demanded the facts and the names. Detective Harris sued for defamation. The town, which had leaned on certainty for generations, found itself divided between those who saw a miracle and those who demanded courtrooms rather than altars. For Michael, the miracle was a complicated thing. It delivered him from a sentence he did not deserve, but it also returned him to a world that expected him to be different because he had been touched by light. He felt awkward in the presence of other people's pity. He had lost 8 years, and no amount of explanation could grow them back. He also felt something like a mission. The image that had warmed his hands now sat on a small altar in his mother's house, where he would kneel and weep and whisper thanks. He vowed to do something he had never considered before. He would use what little compensation the state offered to start a foundation to help others who'd been wrongly convicted. But even as Michael made plans, the town's story reached outward. Television vans came, some bearing cameras, some bearing skepticism like a lens cap. reporters who had never known Holloway before wanted interviews and the shrine's history and the lab's reports. The county's legal files filled with motions. An old rumor surfaced that the shrine had once been blessed by a traveling priest decades ago. An elderly woman in a nursing home swore she had seen the images like once before and had been healed of an ailment after a picture glowed in the night. And yet, for all the talk, there remained a single small, stubborn fact everyone had to admit: no scientist could explain the light that had filled cell 47, and no legal document could restore the 8 years Michael had lost. The miracle, if miracle it was, had done what miracles sometimes do: changed the direction of human hearts in a way that made truth step forward. The town, still smelling a little of coffee and damp wool, tried to put its edges back in order. The shrine at Route 12 was repaired and painted with care by volunteers. People began to leave little notes tied with twine and rosaries that had frayed at the beads. The judge ordered an official review of any convictions in which Harris had been involved. The nation's press moved on to other stories. But the people who lived in Holloway kept the small news alive like coals, adding a log here, blowing carefully there. And yet, even with the legal closure offered and a small altar established, there was one question that would not stop ringing through the town and beyond: why that image, that night, with that man in that cell? Was it a miracle of light, a masked human conscience, or something else entirely? The instruments had given their answers: wood, pigment, no hidden circuits. Witnesses had given theirs: warmth, peace, truth. The court gave its own: motion to dismiss, stay, release. The one voice that had not yet been asked, because it could not speak in any language men used, remained the small image itself. As the courthouse lights dimmed one evening and the town returned to the work of ordinary lives, a young scientist on the team reached for the small frame under a technician's lamp and, with gloved fingers, ran a final test he'd not mentioned earlier. The results flickered on his screen. He swallowed and called the lead investigator into the lab. "You need to see this," he said. They came and looked at the data, and in the same place where instruments had found nothing an hour before, they now found a tiny anomaly, a trace pattern in the varnish that matched no known chemical signature in their database. It was not luminous material, not a chemical residue they could identify, but a microscopic pattern in the wood itself, like a fingerprint only a tree could make. It was so small it could be ignored. It was so strange it could not be. "What is it?" the investigator asked. The scientist frowned. "I don't know, but it wasn't there before we ran the last test." Outside the lab, Holloway's night closed in. Inside, men leaned over lit screens and the little frame rested under glass, waiting as it always had for human hands and human questions. The story that had started with a small light and a confession had grown into something that no one could neatly tie up. People prayed, people argued, people planned, and a little image sat still, as if it were keeping the last word to itself. There was one more piece left to move, one more truth to find, and the town held its breath like a person about to step into a dark room. They did not know then whether to call a priest, a scientist, the town mayor. They only knew that something had happened in cell 47 and that the air tasted different when they breathed it, as if the whole room had been washed and the dirt you carry in your mouth had been taken out. The metal of the cell bars seemed less solid, and the small frame in Michael's hands shone quiet and absolute. As the earliest watchers hovered in the doorway, the thing no one expected happened. "This is where I'll stop for now, not because the story is finished but because the moment is a hinge." Someone made a choice then. Someone would speak the truth and another would remember silence. Holloway's faithful and its skeptics were about to watch whatever this was unfold, and when the first person fell to their knees in the corridor, the town's old stories and the small shrine by Route 12 stirred as if remembering their purpose. There were steps approaching from both ends of the hallway, and a voice, hesitant and raw, saying a single sentence that would ripple outward: "I can't keep this inside anymore." After the late-night lab anomaly, that tiny, inexplicable fingerprint in the varnish, Holloway felt as if the world had tilted on a small but permanent hinge. People walked a little slower. They remembered the way the light had not cut like a spotlight but softened like bread in the mouth. The story that had once been about a crime and a courtroom became, for many, a story about mercy and what it does to stubborn hearts. Investigators kept pulling threads. Detective Richard Harris, when confronted with a paper trail that suddenly accumulated in his old files, notes, payments, calls, did not find his old swagger very helpful. Courts are built on evidence, but they are also built on human testimony. The testimony that had once put Michael behind bars began to fray. Harris was indicted for misconduct in several cases. His reputation, which had once been as solid as the badge on his chest, crumbled under the weight of men who had been afraid for too long. Some of those men had new courage, others simply could not bear the thought of speaking until they saw the tiny frame glow in a cell block at 3 in the morning. The legal fallout was messy and painfully human. Families of the dead officer felt betrayed anew. They had lived with grief that never left, and now that grief had to make space for rage, for the practical work of reopening evidence and re-examining conclusions. Holloway's small paper printed statements from both sides. "We want truth," read one headline. Below it, "No one can bring Patrick back," another headline reminded readers. It was the county's way of balancing justice and sorrow. Through it all, there was Michael Carter moving another way. He felt forever marked by what had happened in that corridor. The glow had not erased the boy who had kicked the shrine or the sinner who had once been willing to do things to survive. But it had touched something deeper, a stubbornness now retooled into a quiet purpose. Michael started a foundation, a small non-profit that would help the wrongly convicted find legal aid. He used the modest compensation from the state and pushed local donors and sympathetic lawyers to give time and money. He held meetings in the basement of the church where Pastor Thomas Mackenzie would bring coffee and listen, nodding like he'd once nodded in a visitation room. The foundation became the innocent miracle of a life finding a new course. Men who had been dismissed in court found representation, stories that had been sealed in the shadows of a courthouse were reopened and, in several cases, the wrongfully convicted found freedom. Michael learned how to speak in rooms that were not prison cells. He learned how to sit across from a judge and tell the truth without expecting it to be enough. He learned how to be patient when the legal gears moved slow. His hands, once quick to do harm, were now busy with paperwork, with envelopes, with the tender logistics of rebuilding lives. He visited other prisons, he brought rosaries, he let a man who had spent 20 years behind bars take his hand and weep on the foundation's couch. The shrine at Route 12 became a small pilgrimage site without anyone organizing a tour. Old women tied ribbons to the oak, teenagers left coins, and weary travelers, driving through with no expectation of anything beyond a safe road, found themselves slowing and crossing themselves reflexively. The little framed image that had glowed in that prison cell sat, carefully preserved, on an altar in Michael's modest living room. He kept it there the way a man keeps a letter from a parent who had been gone for a long time. With a mixture of reverence that bordered on superstition and common-sense care, people came to see it. Some knelt, some stood and said nothing, some touched the glass as if testing the boundary between the ordinary and the holy. Those visits, private, often quiet, became part of how Holloway told its own story. The mayor, who had once tried to stay neutral, began to attend one of Pastor Mackenzie's evening talks. The scientist who had found the varnish anomaly took a week's unpaid leave to sit in the church's back pew and think about how the limits of his instruments felt suddenly less important in the face of a human life rebuilt. Even skeptical reporters often came back, not to write lead paragraphs about miracles, but to understand the small, stubborn changes in people who had seen the light and later chose to do something with it. Not all change was easy. The families of Officer Patrick O'Connor had a long, raw season of grieving all over again. Some of them refused to come to Michael's talks. They read the court transcripts for new answers and felt that no explanation could suffice. Others, later, came to the foundation's door, not to forgive but to understand. Those were the hardest conversations Michael had. He sat across from mothers and fathers who had lost someone important and listened in a way he had not been taught to listen when he was younger. There were sometimes tears, sometimes anger, always a sense that truth itself is a cumbersome, beautiful thing that does not arrive in time to undo pain. Time did what it always does, it changed the way the town viewed itself. Holloway, once a town that pegged people to a single reputation, learned, slowly and painfully, that people could change and that change could demand different kinds of courage. The priest who had visited Michael in prison, Pastor Mackenzie, became both the town's moral face and its quiet listener. He preached less from the top of the pulpit and more from the circle of a coffee table, inviting people to tell their truths. He had a way of saying, "Mercy wants to be used," and the town took that up like a new farming tool. As for Michael's personal life, it unfolded in ways that seemed both ordinary and marked. He met someone at a volunteer meeting, a woman named Claire who worked as a paralegal for the foundation. She had the kind of smile that did not expect much of herself but believed in the work she did. They married in a small ceremony at the church where the same people who had visited him through glass came to offer blessings. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl who learned how to say a rosary before they could count to 10. Michael watched them grow with a fierce, careful gratitude. He thought of his mother, Maria, and how she had prayed every week for the son she never stopped believing could be better. Maria grew older in the best way, seemed with age and with a kind of peace that comes when a litany you've prayed finally seems to answer. She remained the town's quiet pillar, the woman whose medal had become the story's knot. In 2010, at 79, she died at home surrounded by family. The funeral was full of the town's softest noises, whispered prayers, slow sobs, and, somewhere between them, the sense that the arc of a life had come to a close with a small, private glory. Michael kept The old medal and the framed image, he watched his children tuck notes into the shrine and tie their miniature rosaries to it. He taught them to be careful with both faith and facts. People talk about miracles in different ways. For some, the miracle was the way the small frame had glowed in a prison corridor. For others, its truest miracle was the way people like David Walsh found the courage to unburden themselves and set truth moving like a pebble turning a still pond into ripples. Some argued that the light was real and divine. Others insisted it was an event of human conscience catalyzed by the fear that had finally met its end. Still others, scientists, skeptics, slow-thinking men and women, said both things could be true. The frame itself remained a stubborn, silent witness. Years later, an independent theological panel convened in Holloway's small community center to discuss the implications. They invited scientists and priests, skeptics and survivors. They read transcripts and lab reports and watched old video footage of the corridor the night the light had shone. They did not come to a neat answer. They left with more questions and a deeper sense of how little human language holds when it tries to pin down mercy. Holloway continued to be, in some ways, an ordinary town. The factory bell still rang on time, and the diner still served pie with an extra scoop of ice cream. People still laughed and argued and buried their dead, but the story of that light altered the town's memory like a river shifts a bank. Slowly, persistently, a woman who had been a teacher for 40 years retired early to volunteer full-time with Michael's foundation. A young man who had been tipped into petty crimes made a different choice after visiting the shrine and later volunteered in the hot afternoons at the prison's library. An electrician who had laughed at the whole affair confessed, years later, that he now kept a small rosary in his toolbox. There were arguments still, of course. The county never stopped needing clear evidence for its decisions. Courtrooms remained the places where legal truth mattered, but what Holloway learned, painfully and beautifully, was that truth in the human heart often needs a prod to move. For them, the prod had been a soft gold light and a man's confession. For other towns, it might be a letter or a photograph or a story shared around a kitchen table that finally convinces someone to speak. In the end, what stayed with people was not a proof one could place in a filing cabinet. It was the change they saw in themselves and in each other. Michael's life became a map of that change. A boy who once laughed at a shrine, a man who once lived with the shame of a sentence he could not clear, and then someone who spent his days helping others seek justice. People in Holloway would tell visitors about the night in a soft voice, not shouting it like a claim but offering it like a piece of bread. Take it, see if it helps you. There is one last quiet moment I want you to hold. Years after his release, on an autumn night when the town smelled of wet leaves and wood smoke, Michael sat alone in his living room with the framed image on his knees. The house hummed with the sleeping breath of his children in the next room and a clock that measured time like a steady heart. He looked at the little painting of the Virgin and thought about the poor. Strange, holy ways mercy sometimes shows up. He wondered about the line between chance and something richer. He whispered a prayer and did not expect an answer in any language he had learned. Then, very softly, the varnish warmed under his thumb. The glow came again, not as a spectacle but like the echo of a kindness, small and intimate. Michael felt the warmth as if an old hand had been placed on his shoulder. He did not tell anyone that night. He did not even write about it in his journal. He simply sat and let himself breathe in the quiet. He had learned something the hard way. Miracles do not always come with bandwagons and headlines. Sometimes they come as a private rescue, a small widening of a chest where shame used to be lodged. If something about this story stays with you, let it be the way mercy looks when it finds a place to work. It is not always loud, it does not always heal everything, but it changes the course of some lives, and those lives change other lives in turn. Holloway did not become a perfect town, it became a town that had, once, been touched by a thing they could not fully explain and chose to do something with that touch. That is enough for some of us. Thank you for staying with the story. If this moved you even a little, please like the video and subscribe to our channel so we can keep telling stories that walk the line between prayer and wonder. Leave a comment with your name and where you're watching from. We include everyone in our shared prayer. Share this with someone who needs a little light tonight. God bless, and thank you for listening.